By far, the most famous and the most criticized crusade of them all is what has come to be known as the First Crusade. It captivates widespread attention because, in many ways, the story of the First Crusade is the ultimate tale of survival and success against all odds. It is the stuff that legends are made of, and yet, as fantastic as it may seem, it really happened. And while I shall not make any attempt to downplay the fact that recounting the events of the First Crusade plays out like a thrilling adventure, my purpose in this video is academic. I primarily intend to educate viewers rather than to entertain them. But while I will absolutely be delving into the bloody battles, the political intrigue, and the charismatic cast of characters, there will also be frequent surveys of the scholarly literature as I attempt to set the record straight concerning the First Crusade. The First Crusade is, perhaps, the favorite whipping boy of critics of the Crusades, both because it is, by far, the most famous crusade of them all, and also because it seems to provide a target-rich environment for moral condemnation and outrage. According to the popular narrative, the story of the First Crusade begins in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II preached a fiery sermon calling for a crusade against the Muslim infidels. In this sermon, according to the popular narrative, Urban told greatly exaggerated, if not wholly fabricated, stories about Muslim atrocities towards Christians. This sermon, coupled with a healthy dose of greed, stirred up the knighthood of Europe to march on Jerusalem in a great crusade. But Muslims were not the only target, for the intolerant knights of Europe began crusading against and slaughtering the Jews within Europe even before the First Crusade was fully underway, thereby setting the precedent for the Holocaust. Despite promising to return captured land to the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders went back on their word. They captured the city of Antioch through trickery and slaughtered the inhabitants in an unprecedented act of brutality. Moreover, they cannibalized the corpses of the fallen Muslims in a chest-thumping act of terrorism. When they at last took Jerusalem, they indiscriminately slaughtered the entire population before kneeling in their blood to praise God for their glorious victory. This heinous and brutal slaughter in Jerusalem shocked the Muslim world because of the unparalleled viciousness the Crusaders showed themselves to be capable of exercising, and that is the story of the First Crusade, at least according to detractors and critics. As just observed, popular histories of the First Crusade tend to begin with the Council of Clermont in 1095. For example, Jill Claster, in her generally terrible book Sacred Violence, opens by saying, "Beginnings and endings are often difficult for historians to determine. For the history of the Crusades, however, the beginning is unmistakable. It is the inauguration of the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095. This in itself is a serious mistake and is the reason why I released an entire video on the prehistory of the Crusades prior to this one, because it is essential to understand the Crusades in context. As we saw in that prior video, the seeds of the First Crusade were not sown by Pope Urban in 1095, but rather by Muhammad in the 7th century, and by his followers over the next 4. For without the 4 centuries of aggressive Islamic expansion into Christian territory, the First Crusade would never have occurred. As Thomas Madden correctly notes, the message was clear. Christ was crucified again in the persecution of his faithful and the defilement of his sanctuaries. The Knights of Christ were called to be the avengers of an injured God. This is made painfully clear by the fact that Pope Urban's sermon was the fulfillment of a request he had received from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I. The Seljuk Turks had converted to Islam and had been chipping away at the Byzantine Empire for quite some time. After a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Massacre, Alexius realized that he did not have the military resources to hold back the Turks. In desperation, he dispatched a letter to the Pope asking for aid in the name of Christian Brotherhood. As even Stephen Runciman says, the Battle of Massacre was the most decisive disaster in Byzantine history. The Byzantine themselves had no illusions about it. Again and again, their historians referred to that dreadful day. To the later Crusaders, it seemed that the Byzantines had forfeited on the battlefield their title as the protectors of Christendom. Massacre justified the intervention of the West. Thomas Asbridge adds, Byzantium had for centuries been fighting in an almost constant battle for survival, surrounded by enemies. When Muslim warriors began pouring out of Arabia in the 7th century, much of the Eastern Roman Empire, including Syria and Palestine, was overrun. From this point forth, the Byzantines faced an unending struggle to hold on to Asia Minor against Islam. Indeed, Constantinople itself was besieged in 668 and again in 717. Being Catholic, Pope Urban had never gotten along particularly well with the Byzantines, but the Byzantine Empire was strategically useful to the Pope inasmuch as it provided a barrier between much of Catholic Europe and the armies of Islam. So despite his conflicts with Alexius, Urban had ample motivation to not allow the buffer state between Catholic Europe and Islam to simply collapse. He would much rather that the Byzantines continue holding back the Muslims rather than putting that drain on the Catholic Europeans. Because of this, he acquiesced to Alexius's request, which culminated in the Council of Clermont in 1095. Again, Asbridge says, the first point to acknowledge is that the call to arms made at Clermont was not directly inspired by any recent calamity or atrocity in the East. Urban's sermon may have been stimulated, at least in part, by the Byzantine appeal for military aid received some 8 months earlier at the Council of Piacenza, but this request was not itself tied to any recent Greek defeat, resulting instead from decades of mounting Muslim aggression in Asia Minor. While the specific content of Urban's speech is made somewhat difficult to ascertain by the numerous conflicting accounts of what he said, all accounts agree that a big part of Urban's justification for calling a crusade was the atrocities that had been perpetually perpetrated against Christians in the Holy Land. Many historians argue that Urban exaggerated the degree to which Christians were suffering under the iron fist of Islamic rule. Brian Catlos goes as far as to claim that these reports were fabricated, saying, Urban's instructions are precise. Take back the Holy Land, and his evocation of the atrocities inflicted on the Eastern Christians are absolute fabrications. But even if some exaggeration took place, as I argued in my previous video, there is abundant evidence, independent of Urban, to show that life for Christians under Muslim leadership was quite horrific. At no time was the mistreatment of Christians more apparent than under the reign of the Caligula-like Tariq al-Hakim. As Rodney Stark explains, in 996, Tariq al-Hakim became the 6th Fatimid Caliph in Egypt at the age of 11 and ruled until he disappeared at age 36. He ordered that all the dogs in Cairo be killed, that no grapes be grown or eaten to prevent the making of wine, that women never leave their homes, and that shoemakers cease making women's shoes. Hakim also outlawed chess and the eating of watercress or any fish without scales. He suddenly required that everyone work at night and sleep during the day, since these were his preferred hours. He murdered his tutor and nearly all of his visitors, large numbers of other high officials, poets, and physicians, and many of his relatives, often doing the killing himself. He cut off the hands of the female slaves in his palace. To express his opposition to public baths for women, he had the entrance to the most popular one suddenly walled up, entombing alive all who were inside. Hakim also forced all Christians to wear a 4-pound cross around their necks, and Jews to wear an equally heavy carving of a calf, as shame for having worshipped the golden calf. Finally, Hakim had his name substituted for that of Allah in all mosque services. Then Hakim ordered the burning or confiscation of all Christian churches. Eventually about 30,000 were burned or pillaged, and the stripping and complete destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, including all traces of the carved-out tomb beneath it. Word of this outrage caused an enormous wave of anger all across Europe, a bitter grievance that was later rekindled by those who recruited volunteers for the First Crusade. Of course, Tariq al-Hakim is an extreme example, but the fact remains that Christians truly had no rights under the Islamic regime. They could be subjected to the worst sorts of persecution and torture at any time, and they frequently were. Consequently, liberating their Christian brothers and sisters from Islamic tyranny was a major motivating factor for most of the early Crusaders. Thus, in contrast to the popular narrative, which would suggest that the First Crusade was an unprovoked invasion of the East, the Crusaders very much viewed this as a just war. Asbridge explains, "We know that Urban urged Western Christendom to pursue two interlocking goals: the liberation of the Eastern churches, most notably by bringing military support to the beleaguered Byzantine Empire, and the reconquest of the Holy Land, in particular the city of Jerusalem." From the start, he conceived of the campaign as a war of defense and repossession. The crusade was not launched as an evangelical enterprise to bring about the conversion of Muslims, forced or voluntary, but to protect and recover Christian territory. This was to be a war of religion, but one that focused upon physical power, not ephemeral theology. His appeal seems to have been loosely structured around the three Augustinian principles of just war: legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention. He took just cause as the key theme for his proposed campaign, launching into a polemical oration peppered with inflammatory images of Muslim atrocities. No one could have anticipated the response that Urban's sermon provoked. News of this holy war spread across Christendom like wildfire via the battle cry, "God wills it." Messengers and clerics preached the crusade across all of Europe, inspiring thousands to take up the cross and vow to liberate the Holy Land. As Asbridge remarks, at first glance, it might appear that Pope Urban's sermon at Clermont had an almost miraculous impact, that his words fell like fiery sparks upon bone-dried tinder, instantaneously igniting the imagination and enthusiasm of Latin Christendom to produce an extraordinary, unprecedented, perhaps even inexplicable response. In the 12 months following the Council of Clermont, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men, women, and children, drawn from across the face of Western Europe, answered the Pope's rallying cry. The reaction to the call for a crusade is made all the more puzzling by the dim prospects for success. The journey was long and expensive. There was no real leader, no real plan, and no practical reason to be optimistic about the chances of success. As Thomas Madden observes, by any reckoning, the First Crusade was a long shot. There was no leader, no chain of command, no supply lines, no detailed strategy. It was simply thousands of warriors marching deep into enemy territory, committed to a common cause. The unpromising practical considerations were apparently simply outweighed by the spiritual conviction that God wanted this. God was on the Crusaders' side, and that he would not allow them to fail. Cynical modern critics of the Crusades have been quick to cast aspersions at this pious explanation for the zeal with which Europe answered the call, preferring instead to speculate that the Crusaders were more interested in looting the wealth of the Muslims. For example, Stephen O'Shea claims religious fervor, which the Crusaders had in spades, did not preclude or even hinder their worldly ambition. Faith may even have stoked it, the certainty of divine approval making the business of enriching oneself while eviscerating one's enemy a saintly enterprise. Now, as I demonstrated in the opening video of this series, this cynical explanation simply cannot be correct. Not only were the Crusades notoriously bad for plunder, and not only was crusading so expensive that many crusaders bankrupted themselves and or their families in order to participate, but it is evident from their own written statements on the matter that their intentions were, for the most part, genuinely pious. Prior to the official start of the First Crusade, while armies were still amassing and preparing across Europe, a series of incidents occurred which have been a source of criticism of the Crusades, and, as such, merit some discussion here. Specifically, a German army, which was nominally planning to join the Crusade, decided that it would be easier to attack the Infidels who were living closer to home, namely the Jews living in Europe. These marauders traveled south, attacking and killing various Jewish populations throughout the Rhineland and elsewhere. Their reputation for cruelty began to precede them, turning their neighbors against them. By the time they reached the borders of Hungary, the Knights of Hungary had had enough of them oppressing Jewish populations and confronted them. These marauders never ended up joining the main army at Constantinople, and, as such, can scarcely be considered legitimate crusaders in any sense. Yet because this episode finds parallels with a more recent example of German anti-Semitism, many popular authors have claimed that the Crusades were effectively responsible for the Holocaust. Karen Armstrong is an example of such an author, saying, "Hatred of the Jews continued to be an essential element in crusading. The Crusaders made anti-Semitism an incurable Western disease, which persisted long after the Middle Ages." Similarly, R.I. Moore claims, "From the beginning, then, the Crusades undoubtedly stimulated hostility to the Jews and provided the most appalling occasions for its expression." S.J. Allen and Emily Ampt affirm the same sentiment, claiming, "Every major medieval crusade would be accomplished by pogroms against the Jews of Europe." And Kaner and Kaner add, "The savagery with which the Christians treated the Jewish population forever scarred Judeo-Christian relations." Yet experts have long known that this is a myth. The Crusades did not cause anti-Semitism, but rather occurred within a culture that, by and large, already harbored significant anti-Semitism. The Rhineland Massacre is thus best seen as a result of medieval anti-Semitism rather than the cause of it. As Daniel Frank puts it, It is always important to remember that the Crusades did not themselves create medieval anti-Judaism, but were the product of an anti-Jewish society that had been busy reviewing its relationship with Judaism well before Urban II's sermon at Clermont in 1095. When we examine the evidence closely, it becomes difficult to identify 1096 as a decisive event in Christian and Jewish history. Jewish-Christian disputes followed well-trodden paths after the First Crusade, and they only infrequently mentioned crusading as a point of contention. Jewish populations and prosperity increased throughout the 12th century despite periodic persecutions, many of which had no connection to crusading. Since anti-Judaism long preceded the First Crusade, it is not too much to say that, insofar as the Crusades were anti-Judaic, they were so because the society that produced them was anti-Judaic, had been for centuries, and had begun to reassess its Jewish minority well before 1096. Perhaps that is why, rightly or wrongly, so many Crusade histories spend little time discussing the Jewish experience. The goal and purpose of the Crusade was not to murder or convert Jews. It was to promote the primacy of the Roman papacy, to bring aid to the Christian communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, and to regain control of the Christian holy places in the Levant. At the very least, there really is no convincing way to link the Crusades to Nazi Germany. Similarly, Christopher Tyerman says, "For the Jews, the Rhineland pogroms did not mark the first Holocaust. There had been assaults before, neither did they mark the opening of a sustained campaign against the Jews. If now more wary and uneasy, the Ashkenazic Jewish communities of the Rhineland and Northern Europe survived and thrived for generations despite further atrocities." None of this is, of course, intended to justify the actions of those who massacred Jews, but it is to highlight that this event was not caused by the Crusades. Indeed, as already mentioned, those who engaged in the massacre scarcely deserve to be called Crusaders at all. As Steve Wiedenkopf points out, these marauding murderers in the Rhineland in the late 11th century can hardly be called authentic Crusaders. Although these warriors may have taken the cross and endeavored to follow Urban's call by journeying to Jerusalem, they never completed their pilgrimage. Contrary to modern myth, the persecution of the Jews, which occurred at the beginning of the crusading movement, was not the first Holocaust or the beginning of a long period of Christian anti-Semitism. Rather, these horrible pogroms were motivated not by love of Christ and concern for personal salvation, but by mammon. It is also often forgotten that this violence against the Jews was directly condemned by Pope Urban II, that it was put to an end by the Hungarian knighthood, and that even the local German populations made efforts to hide and protect the Jews from these marauders. As Thomas Madden reminds us, the Pope harshly condemned the killings, but there was little more he could do. As it happened, none of these anti-Jewish crusaders made it to the east. Most simply evaporated when resistance in the cities became too severe. Count Emicho pressed on to Hungary, where he continued his belligerence. There, his army was crushed. Ultimately, the Rhineland massacre was carried out by a relatively small band of knights who did not even end up going on the First Crusade, and whose actions were roundly condemned by the rest of Europe. While this chapter is undeniably tragic, it is a mistake to attribute it to the ideology of the Crusaders, or to suggest that it was a precursor to the Holocaust. It is certainly absurd to try to argue that this episode can tell us anything about whether or not the Crusades in general, or the First Crusade in particular, were justified. Nirmal Das correctly concludes, it also must be remembered that even to the medieval mind, this was an aberration of the Crusade ideal, and the Church actively sought to protect Jews. These attacks, though vicious, were not typical and were strongly condemned by the clergy of the day. In other words, persecution of the Jews was not the focus of the First Crusade, which is why it was persistently decried and denounced by the Church. And Jonathan Riley Smith adds, focused persecution against Jews, moreover, occurred in the preparations for, rather than in the course of, Crusades. Meanwhile, the main crusading armies from across Europe were gathering together at Constantinople. There was no official leader of the First Crusade, but the major constituent armies had established commanders. Among the most important of these included Hugh of Vermandois, the King of France's brother, and Raymond, Count of Toulouse, who headed up the major French contribution to the Crusade. Godfrey of Bouillon and his younger brother Baldwin of Boulogne led the German contribution. And lastly, a latecomer by the name of Bohemund of Taranto joined the Crusade, leading the Norman faction. Godfrey and Bohemund would come to distinguish themselves from the others throughout the Crusade. Bohemund would become a rising star early on, though his early successes would cost him dearly later on. As Christopher Tyerman puts it, Bohemund of Taranto is the most controversial leader of the First Crusade. Of all the major surviving commanders, he alone failed to join the march to Jerusalem in 1099, more concerned with securing his hold over Syrian Antioch. Admired for his generalship, his pious credentials have been impugned in light of his priorities in 1099 and his career of attempting to carve out for himself a kingdom in the Balkans at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. Godfrey is a far more obscure figure. Indeed, despite arguably being the most famous figure from the First Crusade, we know next to nothing about him. As Jonathan Riley Smith says, Godfrey is the most famous of the First Crusaders, but the one we can understand the least. Despite the difficulties involved in learning much about him, the final success of the First Crusade would owe ultimately to his personal tenacity and ingenuity. Emperor Alexius, for his part, was undoubtedly both furious and terrified. When he had petitioned the Pope for aid, he was expecting an elite force of a few hundred knights that he could easily command and use for his own purposes. He was surely not expecting this horde of tens of thousands amassing before the very gates of his own city. As Riley Smith explains, as far as Alexius himself was concerned, another issue was paramount. Help of a very different sort than he had envisaged had arrived, and the Crusaders had already caused him major problems as they had advanced through the Balkans and approached Constantinople. He was thoroughly suspicious of them, particularly of Bohemund of Taranto, and he must have felt that he had to find some means of controlling them. Fearing that the Crusaders would take over Constantinople itself, Alexius refused to let the Crusaders inside, forcing them to camp outside the city walls. He did summon the leaders of the Crusade within Byzantium for a private audience. He persuaded most of them to promise to return any conquered lands and fortifications back to the Byzantine Empire. In exchange for this, Alexius promised to supply the Crusaders with food and supplies as they marched towards Jerusalem. After the armies were all gathered together and the oaths had been sworn, Alexius, anxious to get these zealous pilgrims moving away from Constantinople, assisted in ferrying them across the Bosporus over to Asia Minor. Godfrey of Bouillon and his army arrived on shore first. Had there been Muslim resistance to the landing, the First Crusade might have ended before it began. But fortunately, the Turks of the region were too busy fighting one another to prioritize halting the crusade. As Thomas Asbridge narrates, Godfrey met little or no resistance when he crossed over to Asia Minor, and even isolated as he at first was from the rest of the crusade, his army remained largely unmolested. This was a real stroke of luck. In similar circumstances, the People's Crusade had been virtually annihilated. Had the major Muslim ruler in the region, Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Turkish Sultan of Rum, chosen to pick off the individual contingents of the main crusading army as they landed, the entire Frankish expedition might well have collapsed. As it was, Kilij Arslan made a disastrous military blunder. Having defeated the People's Crusade with relative ease, he vastly underestimated the strength of this second wave of crusaders, and, rather than deal with them head on, he chose first to resolve a relatively minor territorial dispute far to the east. This would prove a costly error. Riley Smith adds, although none of them knew it, the Crusaders were marching towards an open door. Once all the Crusaders were ashore, the Crusaders marched on Nicaea for what would become the first serious military engagement of the First Crusade. But with Kilij Arslan away, Nicaea was severely undermanned and unprepared to deal with this large western army. Again, Asbridge says, the Crusaders' arrival terrified the Turkish garrison of Nicaea. The city would probably have been manned by no more than a few thousand troops, each aware that Nicaea offered irresistibly ripe pickings to the massive Frankish horde. Kilij Arslan's capital stood not only as a bastion of the Sultan's military and political pride, it was also home to his treasury. Under the circumstances, the garrison rightly judged that the Crusaders would throw every resource into the siege. Against such odds, the Turks could not hope to prevail. Still, the Muslims had hope that they could hold out long enough for Kilij Arslan to return with a relief force. Consequently, in the early weeks of the siege, they put up stiff resistance. As Raymond Ibrahim describes, although the besiegement was brutal, the Turks held their own. From their high walls, the Muslims shouted their warlike battle cries in the horrible tones of their language. Shrill jihadist cries, such as Allah Akbar, were still indecipherable for early chroniclers, and fired poison arrows so that even those lightly wounded met a horrible death, writes Guibert of Nogent. Moreover, in order to defend their walls from being struck and shaken repeatedly by the battering ram, the Turks created a combustible mixture and poured it over the walls, which torched the battering ram. Smoke and fire rose as the siege went on for weeks. Before long, news arrived that Kilij Arslan had indeed returned with an army to save his capital city. Arslan's initial clash with the Crusaders was to be the first test of Western versus Eastern pitched battle fighting tactics of the Crusades. The differences in strategy and equipment are one of the factors that make Crusade battles so unpredictable. As William Urban puts it, the contrast between the brute force of Western knights and the subtlety of the swift, lightly armed Turkish and Arab warriors is part of what makes the Crusades interesting from the intellectual point of view. There was never a question of two armies simply going at one another, with the stronger and more numerous prevailing. Instead, there was a complex interaction of strategy and tactics each side possessing advantages and disadvantages, with the commanders weighing and calculating each move carefully before committing their forces to action. In this case, however, vast superiority of numbers would win the day. Unfortunately, Kilij Arslan had severely underestimated just how large the Crusaders' army actually was. Asbridge explains, Kilij Arslan had returned from the east. Having finally realized how dangerous the Crusaders might be, he had gathered a large army from across the Sultanate of Rum, and was even now camped in the steep hills to the south of the city, planning a counterattack the very next day. The princes reacted quickly to the shocking revelations. They knew that Raymond of Toulouse and the army were already en route to Nicaea, and were, at that very moment, perhaps less than a day's march away to the north. In fact, Raymond of Toulouse arrived just in time. His army was still in the process of setting up camp before Nicaea's southern gate when Kilij Arslan's forces came pouring out of the hills. He had come prepared for victory. His men carried ropes with which to bind the Crusaders once they were taken captive, but, even without the reinforcements, Kilij Arslan would have been hard-pressed to overcome the massive Latin army. With Nicaea's southern gate blocked, his troops were both outnumbered and isolated. Faced with staunch resistance from the army led by Raymond and Baldwin of Boulogne, hemmed in by the lake to the west, and struck in the flank by Godfrey's and Bohemun's fierce cavalry charge from the east, the Turkish attack soon faltered. Realizing that he was hopelessly outnumbered, Kilij Arslan fled the field south. After the Crusaders warded off Kilij Arslan's army, and after a 5-week siege, Nicaea eventually fell. The Siege of Nicaea is probably the single example of Crusaders and Byzantines working together productively. As Thomas Asbridge says, the fall of Nicaea was a product of the successful policy of close cooperation between the Crusaders and Byzantium. The Franks would probably have enjoyed little success without Greek aid, while Alexius had needed the might of the Latin army to overcome Kilij Arslan's capital. Soon after this, Crusader and Byzantine relations would rapidly deteriorate irreparably, eventually leading to the notorious sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. It's important to note that the Byzantines laid much of the foundation for this eventuality by setting a precedent of treating the Crusaders badly and taking their support for granted. After Nicaea fell, the Byzantines immediately took possession of both the city and Kilij Arslan's treasury, refusing the Crusaders any plunder in exchange for their efforts in taking Nicaea. Needless to say, this caused many of the Crusaders to sour on their relationship with their Byzantine allies. As Thomas Madden notes, when the Crusaders awoke, they found the imperial banners flying over the city walls. Many of the Crusaders felt cheated. They had sworn to restore property like this to the emperor, and they were now robbed of their opportunity to break their oath. Surely a little plundering was justified, many grumbled, if only of the Muslim inhabitants. After the Siege of Nicaea, the Crusaders continued on towards Jerusalem, making preparations to take the next major strategic Muslim stronghold on their route, Antioch. However, there were simply too many people in the army for the Crusader force to move as a whole. As Asbridge observes, the Crusaders' next major target was Antioch, hundreds of kilometers to the east, but to reach this, the expedition would have to overcome two challenges. First was the enormous size of the Crusade. An army of roughly 70,000 people might take up to 3 days to march past a single point. Moving as one massed force would be incredibly unwieldy and place intense pressure on local resources, given that the Franks intended to continue their practice of foraging for food as they went. Logic dictated that the expedition should break into smaller contingents, traveling just as it had en route to Constantinople, but this approach had inherent dangers. The threat posed by the Seljuk Turks of Asia Minor may have been beaten back at Nicaea, but it had not been extinguished. The Crusaders must have suspected that Kilij Arslan would, at some point, attempt a counterattack. By splintering into smaller armies, the Latin host would lose its overwhelming numerical advantage. In the end, the Crusader army divided into two halves, with Godfrey leading one army and Bohemund leading the other. They attempted to keep contact with one another, but given the limitations on communication between medieval armies, eventually Bohemund's army became completely separated from Godfrey's. Isolated and vulnerable, the stage was set for the first major battle of the Crusades, the Battle of Dorylaeum. Asbridge observes, "This was the opportunity that Kilij Arslan had been waiting for. After his humiliating defeat at Nicaea on May 16th, he realized that every scrap of available manpower would be needed were he to have any hope of defeating the huge Frankish army. Putting aside past quarrels, he negotiated a pact with the Danish-mended Turks of northern and eastern Asia Minor, and set off to intercept the Crusaders. Even with his new larger army, he could ill afford to risk a full-scale battle against the massed Latin ranks. Instead, he hoped to pick off smaller portions of their army through ambush and guerrilla warfare. On the morning of July 1st, 1097, he took his chance." And Raymond Ibrahim adds, "There, at Dorylaeum, the Westerners got their first real taste of nomadic warfare." Before the Crusaders knew what was happening, the Turks' ambush was in full effect. Large numbers of Turkish cavalry were encircling the horrified Crusaders, peppering them with arrows, and wearing them down before they could even respond. The Europeans were more heavily armored than their Muslim counterparts, and, consequently, they were accustomed to having some time to prepare for battle. The Muslims, by contrast, depended more heavily on speed and stealth. The Battle of Dorylaeum was the first sustained test of the Crusaders' reliance on brute force against the Muslim dependence on speed and agility. Rodney Stark explains the advantages that the Crusaders would have had in combat in close quarters, saying, "In the era of the Crusades, the European knights rode horses weighing about 12 to 1300 pounds, while the Muslim cavalry was mounted on horses weighing about 7 to 800 pounds. This gave the Crusaders a considerable advantage when it came to man-to-man fighting, for the man on the larger, taller horse was striking down at his opponent, and his horse could push the other horse around. It also was important because the average Crusader cavalryman weighed far more than did his Muslim counterpart. For one thing, he was a larger man, but the major weight factor was the difference in armor." Thomas Asbridge adds, "The first Crusaders deployed mass cavalry charges, and the expedition's finest generals experimented with the tactical possibilities of this weapon, but we should not imagine that the knights who marched off to Jerusalem were used to fighting in tight, disciplined formations, nor that they could be controlled in battle with chess piece-like precision. On the whole, fighting on the Crusade was a bloody, ragged affair, characterized by chaotic, close-quarter combat. Under these conditions, it was the Latin knights' ruthless brutality that made them such a potent force." The Crusaders could have easily collapsed and run away in fear at this point. Fortunately, their leaders, Bohemund of Taranto and Robert of Normandy, kept their cool and rallied the encircled Crusaders into a defensive formation. Asbridge describes the situation as follows. In a moment of extraordinary courage and composure, Bohemond and Robert kept their heads and stayed the pulse of panic rushing through their forces. They realized that, in the face of such an enemy, only steadfast unity offered any hope of survival. If the Crusaders broke formation or sought to escape, they would be mown down without mercy. As the Turks swarmed towards them, the princes sent an urgent appeal for reinforcement to the Second Crusader army and ordered a makeshift camp to be set up beside a nearby marsh. Into its center were placed all the army's heavy gear, horses, women, children, and other non-combatants, while the knights and infantry were deployed in a tight-knit defensive formation. The prince's plan was to hold fast in close formation, stubbornly refusing to be drawn into open battle, while relying upon weight of numbers and superior armor to survive. They were playing a desperate waiting game, always hoping for the Second Army's arrival. Ranged against them was a seemingly endless, writhing multitude of Turks. Things were looking quite badly for the Crusaders, as the Turks ravaged them hour after hour with arrows, gradually wearing them down. The Turks even briefly broke through the Crusader line at one point. It was unquestionably the resolute steadfastness and personal heroism of both Bohemond and Robert that held the Crusaders together. As Asbridge puts it, through 5 dreadful hours, the Franks waited, held together by a potent mixture of faith, fear, and fortitude, inspired by Bohemond's and Robert's immutable stance. This was an extraordinary feat of martial discipline, the product of inspired generalship. In the medieval age, successful military leaders could not simply depend upon strategic awareness or logistical skill. Unable to communicate detailed orders in the midst of fighting, a general was required to command by example, controlling his troops through sheer force of personality. In this context, Bohemond's and Robert's achievements in the battle near Dorylaeum were of the highest order. At last, Godfrey's army arrived to save the day. Organized in a formidable cavalry charge, the Christian knights of Europe clashed with the Seljuk Turks. They met with little resistance. Demoralized at having had no success in breaking Bohemond's army, despite having numerical superiority and the element of surprise, the Turks had no appetite to take on yet another Crusader army, charging them at full force. With no other options open, the Turks broke and fled. As Raymond Ibrahim recounts, Godfrey and his men were first to the rescue, and wondered where in the world such an infinite number of people had come from. Turks, Arabs, and Saracens stood out among the others. After much bloodshed on both sides, Christian heavy cavalry charges eventually broke up the battle line of the Infidels and put them to flight with dreadful slaughter. Asbridge aptly summarizes the battle as follows. The first Crusaders had had a close brush with disaster, but in the end, they won a famous victory. The Crusaders lost nearly 4,000 men during the Battle of Dorylaeum, but that would pale in comparison to how many they would lose during the next stage of their journey. It was not Muslim soldiers that inflicted the greatest casualties on the Crusaders, but rather the hostile terrain. The Crusaders would learn this the hard way as they embarked on the next stage of their pilgrimage, crossing the anti-Taurus mountains. The real problem, however, was not the loss of men, but the loss of horses. The primary sources stressed the loss of horses as much as, if not more than, the loss of people. Horses were critical not only for transporting wagons and supplies, but were also a critical part of the military effectiveness of Western knights. Without horses, the Crusaders had no military advantage over their Muslim opponents. Again, Asbridge observes, in the past, modern historians have emphasized the military advantage enjoyed by Crusader knights because of their larger, stronger European horses, but, in truth, most of these had died even before Syria was reached, although a few of the richer princes were able to buy horses during the journey. Much of the Frankish army was gradually transformed into an infantry-based force, and, as the expedition progressed, the Latin cavalry became a less decisive weapon. It was during this time that Godfrey's brother Baldwin decided to part company from the Crusade and seek his fortunes elsewhere. He ended up turning his gaze towards the city of Edessa, where he would soon become ruler. As Thomas Madden explains, Edessa was ruled by Toros, who was officially a vassal of the Turks, but in reality acted independently. He did not expect that situation to continue for very much longer without help, so he offered to adopt Baldwin as his successor. Baldwin accepted and entered Edessa among cheering throngs of citizens. Shortly thereafter, a coup toppled Toros, leaving Baldwin as the sole ruler of Edessa, where the Frankish knight settled permanently. Such were the origins of the county of Edessa, the very first of the Crusader states. Meanwhile, after successfully crossing the anti-Taurus mountains, the battered Crusaders were quite close to Jerusalem, their ultimate goal. However, one significant obstacle lay in their path: Antioch. Antioch was both strategically and religiously significant to the Crusaders. Strategically, it needed to be taken so as to command the territory nearest Jerusalem to prevent Muslim aid to Jerusalem. It was also the birthplace of the name Christian, according to Acts 11:16, and so it bore a certain religious significance to the Crusaders. These two considerations provided the Crusaders with ample motivation to conquer the city, but this was far easier said than done. Antioch would prove to be the most difficult city for the Crusaders to take. Indeed, so staunch was the Muslim resistance that, were it not for divine providence or remarkable luck, the First Crusade would have ended outside of Antioch's walls. As Asbridge puts it, the Latins laid siege to Antioch, entering into one of the most brutal, grueling, and prolonged military engagements of the Middle Ages. The Crusade stalled in northern Syria for 1.5 years, and, at this moment, more than any other, its future lay tortuously balanced between utter annihilation and miraculous success. The very concept of crusading was tested to breaking point in the fires of this conflict and ultimately emerged more powerfully and permanently forged. Christopher Tyerman adds, in fact, Antioch almost destroyed the crusade, yet the extraordinary chain of events forged a harder unity of purpose among the mass of the army, a newly strident militant identity and confidence in divine favor expressed in the willingness of the survivors, great and humble alike, to integrate into their language and behavior the rhetoric, symbols, and theater of visionary religious enthusiasm. The governor of Antioch was a Seljuk Turk by the name of Yagishian. He was well aware of the Crusaders' arrival and had taken extraordinary measures to fortify the city and to call for relief forces from surrounding Muslim allies. Antioch wasn't going down without a fight. For 5 weeks, the Crusaders assaulted Antioch with no success. By the end of November, winter was setting in, and the Crusaders were no closer to breaching the walls of Antioch than when they had begun. To the Crusaders' surprise and dismay, Syrian winters could be quite cold, but the real problem for the Crusaders was a lack of food. Starvation claimed more Crusader lives than the defenders of Antioch ever did. As Tyerman says, supplies were sought from as far away as Cyprus, Rhodes, and Crete, but famine loomed, prices soared, hunger claimed men and horses. The army's debilitation reduced the number of volunteers to conduct other vital foraging sorties. The expedition appeared trapped in a vice, unable to make military progress, and incapable of feeding itself. Misery and fear led to desertion. Towards the end of December, the Crusader situation was nothing short of desperate. It was decided that a large foraging party, under the command of Bohemond of Taranto, would seek supplies for the besieging army. This was already a risky move, given that any men who were sent to forage for food would inevitably be absent from the siege, thereby weakening the Crusaders' grip on Antioch. But the situation was even more dangerous than anyone could have predicted, for at this very moment, unbeknownst to the Crusaders, a Muslim relief force from Damascus was nearing Antioch. As luck would have it, the foraging party crossed paths with the relief force on the very last day of the year. The Muslims made the first move in an attempt to surround the hopelessly outnumbered Crusaders, who were caught completely by surprise. Fortunately, Bohemond and his knights prevented the Muslims from completely encircling the Crusaders, leaving them a path to retreat back to the main army. Most of the knights survived, however, the Muslims slaughtered the majority of the Crusader infantry. Yet the Muslims also sustained heavy casualties that were apparently sufficient to convince them to return to Damascus. When Bohemond and the surviving Crusaders returned to Antioch, more bad news awaited them. In their absence, Yagishian had launched a counteroffensive which, although insufficient to break the siege, claimed many Crusaders' lives, and further depleted their already languishing numbers. As Asbridge summarizes, the level of casualties suffered in this engagement was not disastrous, but the defeat was a serious blow to Latin morale. Taken together, the rout at the bridge gate and the events of the foraging battle also raised worrying doubts about the ability of mounted knights and Crusader infantry to cooperate effectively in battle. The events of late December must have strained the bonds of trust between these two forces, and they certainly prompted the Crusades' leaders to reassess their battle tactics in the coming months. The Siege of Antioch dragged on and on. Starvation continued to ravage the Crusaders, and many began to abandon the crusade altogether. By February, news arrived that yet another Muslim relief force was nearing Antioch, this one even larger than the force from Damascus. Bohemond once again proved to be the man of the hour. Taking the 700 knights who still had horses at that point from Antioch, he rode to meet the 12,000 Muslim warriors coming to break the siege. While odds of this magnitude may seem like the stuff of legends, the numbers are confirmed by both Christian and Muslim sources. Outnumbered more than 12 to 1, Bohemond set his knights up to ambush the Muslim army. Asbridge describes the ensuing battle as follows. The Crusaders had one chance for success. They could not hope to prevail in a long drawn-out engagement. Instead, they had to rely upon shock tactics and judicious use of the main weapon, the cavalry charge. Under these conditions, timing was paramount. If they deployed their full force immediately, the brunt of their charge might be absorbed by Ridwan's vanguard, leaving the main Muslim army free to close and partially encircle the Franks. Instead, in a masterful piece of generalship that was probably the brainchild of Bohemond, they divided their forces into 6 squadrons. When Ridwan appeared, 5 of these were deployed against the Aleppan vanguard, while the 6th, under Bohemond, waited in reserve. Knowing that they were heavily outnumbered, these knights must have been terrified, but they played a crucial tactical role. Their shock attack drew Ridwan's main force forward into the heart of the battle. His massed troops now began to push the Crusaders back, and the Aleppans most likely felt that victory was at hand. In fact, this was the moment for which Bohemond had prepared. Now, with the Muslims bunched together in one force, he launched his 6th Squadron in a ferocious cavalry charge. With one bold maneuver, he changed the course of the battle, throwing Ridwan's army into a chaotic rout. The expeditionary force had won a spectacular victory. By the end of winter, the Crusaders' fortunes seemed to be improving. They had repelled the 2 attempted relief forces sent to break their siege against Antioch, and they had survived the cold and starvation of the Syrian winter. Critical supplies arrived, and the Crusader situation was far less desperate. However, Antioch was no closer to surrendering, and the Crusaders were no closer to breaking in. The initial deadlock remained. If force of arms was not going to get the Crusaders into Antioch, another approach was needed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was Bohemond who discovered the alternative way into Antioch. This alternative presented itself in the form of a traitor known as Firuz. For how consequential Firuz's actions would turn out to be, surprisingly little is known about him besides his name. All of the primary sources mention him, but give us a different backstory. Some tell us that there was bad blood between him and Yagishian, although they differ on the details. Some say that Yagishian had confiscated Firuz's wealth. Others say that Yagishian was involved in an affair with Firuz's wife. Other sources say that Bohemond had captured Firuz's son and threatened to kill him. Still other sources simply say that Bohemond just bribed Firuz with promises of wealth. Of course, all of these explanations are compatible with one another, but whatever the motivation for Firuz's betrayal, what is clear is that he was responsible for the defense of a significant portion of Antioch's wall. It was through him that Bohemond would enter Antioch. Tyerman summarizes, the legendary quality of so many incidents during the First Crusade is nowhere more evident than in the story of how Bohemond and an Armenian dissident in Antioch, Firuz, collaborated in allowing the Crusaders to penetrate the walls of the city at a point under the traitor's command on the night of the 2nd through 3rd of June, 1098. This development couldn't have arrived soon enough, for word soon reached the Crusaders that yet another Muslim relief army, under the command of Kerbog, a famed and formidable Muslim general, was heading towards Antioch. Unlike the previous relief forces that they had engaged, Kerbog's army was incomprehensibly large. Contemporary sources give estimates ranging from over 1 million strong to saying that it was incalculable. And while these are doubtless exaggerations, the Crusaders were certainly facing a very large army, unlike anything they had faced before, under a competent and renowned leader. Time was running out to conquer Antioch. If the Crusaders didn't manage to get inside the city quickly, Kerbog would essentially be the hammer that would crush them against the anvil of Antioch's walls. Bohemond held the key to success, but he wasn't prepared to share his new information with the rest of the Crusaders without securing some promises from them first. Specifically, he wanted assurances that, if he managed to get them inside of Antioch, then he would be allowed to rule over Antioch. With Kerbog closing in, the Crusaders had little choice but to agree with Bohemond's demands, despite the fact that this involved going back on a promise that they had made to Emperor Alexius to return all Byzantine lands to him. Bohemond's argument, however, was that this promise was conditional upon Alexius's continued support for the Crusaders, a condition which Alexius had utterly failed to fulfill since the Siege of Nicaea. Here again, we see the roots of the dysfunctional relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, which would ultimately come to a head in the disastrous events of the Fourth Crusade. With his claim to Antioch secure, Bohemund sprung his plan into action. On the evening of the 2nd of June 1098, several crusaders under Bohemund's command entered Firouz's towers. They waited until very early the next day to silently make their way to the gates of Antioch, where they killed the guards and opened the gates of the city, greeted by Godfrey, who was waiting there with the Crusader army. With the gates now open, the Crusaders flowed into Antioch. The Muslim defenders were overwhelmed, and, before long, the Crusaders had claimed Antioch. As Asbridge summarizes, after 8 torturous months of ineffective military investment, the Crusaders finally overcame Antioch's fortification by means of intrigue and bribery. Once within the city, they unleashed a ferocious wave of carnage before which the Muslim garrison could not stand. Repellent as it was, the appalling violence perpetrated by the Latins during the sack of Antioch did in fact improve the Crusades' prospects of success. Their willingness to butcher the city's garrison gave them a reputation for absolute ruthlessness, and in the coming months, other Muslim cities on the road to Jerusalem considered negotiating with the Latins rather than face wholesale destruction. The Crusaders had stolen and battled their way into Antioch, but their success came not a moment too soon. On the very next day, June the 4th, Kerbogue's army began to arrive. The Crusaders were surrounded. Suddenly the besiegers had become the besieged. Much blame has been heaped upon the Crusaders for the violent way in which they conquered Antioch. Gilles Claster claims, "The cruelty unleashed at Antioch presaged even more terrible cruelties to come." And no doubt, many dreadful and indefensible actions did indeed take place. But it must be remembered that, given the rules of warfare at this time, this sort of ravaging of the city was expected if a city did not surrender peacefully. That was the deal. If a city surrendered peacefully to an invading force, leniency was shown. That was a major incentive to simply surrender. If a city chose instead to hold out until the bitter end, commanders essentially let their troops do whatever they wanted to the city as a punishment for not surrendering. This is not, of course, to excuse any atrocities perpetrated by the Crusaders when Antioch fell, but it is to point out that this sort of behavior was not unique to them. It was commonplace in medieval siege warfare. Furthermore, the Muslims within Antioch were not blameless. They virtually invited this ruthless retribution by taunting the Crusaders throughout the siege. Thomas Asbridge documents some of their heinous and barbaric treatment of Christian prisoners, saying, "The Muslims regularly dragged the Greek Christian patriarch of Antioch, who had until then lived peacefully in the city, up to the battlements, hung him upside down from the walls, and beat his feet with iron rods in the sight of the Crusaders. Any captured Latin could expect comparable treatment." Adalbaro, Archdeacon of Metz, was caught playing a game of dice with a young woman in an orchard near the city. He was beheaded on the spot. She, taken back to Antioch, repeatedly raped and then killed. The following morning, their heads were catapulted into the Crusader camp. These acts may appear to be utterly barbaric by modern standards, but they were a staple feature of medieval warfare and became a consistent theme of the Siege of Antioch. In viewing such events, we must try to temper our instinctive judgment with an awareness that, in the 11th century, war was governed by medieval, not modern codes of practice. Raymond Ibrahim adds, Yaghi Shian, who had demanded more jizya payments, launched sporadic persecutions, forced Christians to convert to Islam, and converted Antioch's main cathedral into a horse stable. It is thus not surprising that the Crusaders felt a degree of righteous indignation towards the Muslims of Antioch. Again, this is not to excuse any atrocities perpetrated by the Crusaders, it is just to render their actions more understandable, to enable viewers to understand, in part, why they acted as ruthlessly as they did. The Crusaders must have surely felt as though they had jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire as they prepared themselves for Kerbogue's assault on Antioch. Not only were the Crusaders weakened and demoralized, but they were also outnumbered by Kerbogue. Unlike the Crusaders, Kerbogue was not content to take a passive approach and wait the Crusaders out. He pursued an aggressive strategy, throwing his legions against the walls of Antioch. Asbridge explains, what shocked the Crusaders most was that, with such vast reserves of manpower, Kerbogue was able to unleash a seemingly unending stream of attackers. For 2 days, the fighting raged without pause from dawn till dusk. The sheer brutal intensity of this struggle sent some Crusaders over the edge. One Latin eyewitness recalled that many gave up hope and hurriedly lowered themselves with ropes from the wall tops. And in the city, soldiers returning from the encounter circulated widely a rumor that mass decapitation of the defenders was in store. Despite the ferocity of these attacks, the Crusaders did manage to repel them, forcing Kerbogue to consider a more long-term siege. Unfortunately for the Crusaders, time was on Kerbogue's side as, due to their own months-long siege of Antioch, the city was picked clean of food. As time dragged on, hunger began to set in. Again, Asbridge remarks, after June 14th, Kerbogue adopted a strategy of containment, and as a result, a more insidious and debilitating threat began to unman the Crusaders: starvation. They had already endured terrible shortages of food throughout the preceding winter, but now, stranded in a city which had already been stripped of resources by an 8-month siege, they faced a new level of suffering. Tyerman concurs, saying, for those who remained, a sense of hopelessness was inescapable. Unable to summon help, unaware of any possibility of relief by land or sea, heavily outnumbered, ill-equipped, and near starvation, the Christians, now reduced to perhaps less than 30,000, including non-combatants, had reached their lowest ebb in fortune. Only desperate measures could avert ruin. Seemingly, only a miracle could save the Crusaders, and that's precisely what happened next, if contemporary sources are to be believed. An otherwise unremarkable man, by the name of Peter Bartholomew, began claiming that he had received visions in which St. Andrew had appeared to him and taken him to the church of St. Peter, and there shown him where the relic known as the Holy Lance could be found. The Holy Lance being the spear which pierced Jesus' side while he was on the cross, according to the Gospel of John. Desperate for a solution, certain crusaders began excavating the floor of the church. But it was Peter Bartholomew himself who pulled a piece of rusty metal from the ground, triumphantly claiming that it was indeed the Holy Lance. Historians have long debated the legitimacy of this finding. Perhaps Peter Bartholomew really had been suffering from hallucinations due to the starvation conditions which were afflicting the Crusaders. Presumably, if they dug enough, they would eventually find something that could pass for a holy relic. Perhaps Peter Bartholomew was just a con man who buried this piece of metal there himself before telling anyone that he was receiving visions. Or maybe, just maybe, God actually sent the Crusaders a miracle. Whatever the explanation for this finding, it skyrocketed the Crusaders' morale and their willingness to fight. As Tyerman explains, the objective reality of these visions, or the authenticity of the Holy Lance, are immaterial. What mattered in June 1098 was the Crusaders' belief, although at first, Bishop Adhemar and later others regarded Peter Bartholomew as a charlatan, not least perhaps because they may have seen a holy lance on display in Constantinople. The visions provided the leadership with a precise plan to salvage the crusade. Now convinced that God had not abandoned them, the Crusaders were aflame again with crusading fire. This prompted them to break every rule in the book by giving up their tactical advantage inside the fortified walls of Antioch and sally forth into the Muslim hordes head on. Thomas Asbridge describes the ensuing battle as follows. As the last days of June approached, the Crusaders did, without doubt, make a profoundly courageous decision to face Kerbogue's horde in open battle. Bohemond's plan was outstanding, its execution exceptional. The bridge gate was chosen as the sally point, placing the Latins on the western bank of the Orontes. This limited the number of enemy troops initially encountered because the physical barrier of the river hampered any approach by the besieging Muslim forces stationed at the other gate. Hugh of Vermandois was selected to lead a squadron of archers in the first wave of attack out of the gate. He rushed headlong across the bridge, unleashing an intense volley of arrows that beat back the first line of Muslim troops. The way out of the city now lay open. Bohemond's plan was to deploy his remaining forces onto the plain of Antioch in the immediate wake of Hugh's shock attack, throwing his infantry to the front, and then close with the mounted enemy to cut down their ability to maneuver or use missile weapons. The disposition of the troops was the finest expression of Bohemond's military genius, but even with all his careful planning, the Crusaders might have been crushed as they exited the city had Kerbogue reacted differently. When the Crusaders began to pour out of Antioch, the Muslims could scarcely believe their eyes. How could anyone be so irresponsibly suicidal? They assumed that victory over the Crusaders would be too easy. But whether by luck or divine providence, Kerbogue made a tactical blunder that would turn what should have been an easy victory for the Muslims into, perhaps, the greatest military achievement of Bohemond's career, and, indeed, the entire First Crusade. Asbridge narrates the events thusly. In the end, however, Kerbogue made the worst of all decisions. With the chance for a rapid strike gone, he should have held his ground for battle. Instead, he chose to make a rather panicked, tardy advance. His timing was disastrous, for just as his men approached Antioch, the tide of the battle began to turn. The Crusaders, having forced their way onto the Antiochian plains, almost immediately faced a counterattack from the Muslims who had been guarding the bridge gate, and this was quickly followed up by troops rushing from their positions before the gates of St. Paul and the Duke. Then, perhaps most dangerously of all, the Crusaders were attacked from the rear by a force coming from the blockade of the Gate of St. George. At this decisive moment, facing encirclement in open battle, the Crusaders held their ground. Unable to break the Crusaders' resolve, the first wave of attackers, those who had been blockading Antioch, began to panic. With the Franks advancing to press home their advantage, these Muslims turned tail and fled. At that same moment, Kerbogue arrived at the head of his secondary force and ran straight into his own routed comrades. Now in headlong retreat, they shattered the formation of his troops, and soon the entire Muslim army was thrown into disarray. Kerbogue failed to rally his army, and one by one, the contingents that had followed him to Antioch cut their losses and fled the field. In the end, the shock of a sharp, powerful attack and the unwavering solidarity of the Crusader formation exposed deep-seated fractures within the Muslim army. After only a brief engagement, Kerbogue was forced into retreat and ignominious defeat. Disgraced, he returned home to Mosul. If several eyewitnesses are to be believed, it was not Kerbogue's tactical mistake alone that won the day for the Crusaders. These witnesses claim that a bright angelic army came down from heaven as God's reward, honoring the faith of the Crusaders. As Thomas Madden documents, against all odds, the Crusaders had won a smashing victory, but not alone. Many of the combatants, and those watching from the walls, attested to the presence of armies of angels and saints, as well as the spirits of their fallen comrades, fighting alongside Bohemond's troops against the forces of the Turks. Raymond Ibrahim comments on this by saying, "All medieval chronicles portray the victory as a miracle. Were not angelic hosts, led by Saint George, patron saint of Christian warriors, espied by many fighting alongside the knights? However one wishes to interpret such visions, the fact remains, modern military historians have attempted to come up with a more rational explanation for the Franks' success, but the task is difficult. How did a force as spent and starved as the Crusaders manage to overcome a superior, well-fed, and well-rested adversary?" Jonathan Riley Smith likewise says, "This extraordinary victory has never been explained, although it may be that Kerbogue, who should never have allowed the whole Christian army to emerge from a single gate across a bridge before engaging it, could not prevent his forces being sucked piecemeal into the melee. The Crusaders rationalized it by ascribing it to the appearance of a heavenly army of angels, saints, and the ghosts of their own dead, which intervened on their side." However the merits of these reports are judged, it is easy to see why the Crusaders regarded their victory over Kerbogue as being nothing short of a miracle. The great battle for Antioch should have broken the First Crusade by all reasonable metrics, yet somehow the Crusaders managed to snatch a glorious victory from the jaws of certain defeat. Asbridge sums up the magnitude of this victory as follows: "The significance of the great Battle of Antioch cannot be overstressed. It was, without doubt, the single most important military engagement of the entire expedition. The Crusaders had, throughout June 1098, faced the very real possibility of annihilation. The Muslim army was both larger and better equipped than that of the Latins, containing a sizable cavalry element. The Crusaders took an enormous, but arguably necessary risk in meeting this force. Zealous conviction, gifted generalship, and a healthy dose of luck brought them victory against all the odds. To contemporary writers, this achievement was so extraordinary that it could only be explained as a miracle." Jonathan Riley Smith adds, "I am inclined to believe that the authority of Christ, the most characteristic feature of crusading, was originally introduced in a conventional, even a muffled way, and that it was the extraordinary series of events that followed which convinced the Crusaders that they really were engaged in a divine enterprise." Now that Antioch was firmly within the Crusaders' hands, the Crusaders were free to set their efforts towards capturing their ultimate prize, Jerusalem. However, this endeavor stalled when internal squabbles broke out among the Crusaders regarding what they should do with Antioch. On the one hand, they had promised to return conquered cities to the Byzantine Emperor Alexius. On the other hand, in a moment of desperation, they had promised Bohemond the city if he could manage to get them inside. This looming inconvenience was now brought to the forefront. Bohemond's argument was straightforward. The leadership of the Crusade had promised him Antioch in return for getting them inside. Whatever promises were made to Alexius were conditional upon his continued support for the crusade, an obligation upon which he had long since reneged. As Asbridge puts it, whether self-serving or pragmatic, Bohemond's intentions were fairly transparent. He wanted to rule Antioch. Bohemond argued that the Byzantines had failed to reinforce the Crusaders at Antioch, thereby forfeiting any rights to the city. His position was strengthened once news eventually arrived of the Greeks' decision to turn back from Philomelium. At this crucial juncture, the Council of Princes failed to take decisive action. Instead, they abdicated responsibility. If the emperor arrived with his army, he could have Antioch. If not, the city was Bohemond's. With Antioch in Bohemond's hands, at least for the time being, the Crusaders decided to not attack Jerusalem in the summer and postponed the assault on Jerusalem until November. With Antioch and the surrounding area stripped of resources from months of siege, the Crusaders yet again found themselves in need of food. That being the case, the decision was made for the Crusaders to break up into smaller groups to forage for food in different directions. One group, led by Raymond of Toulouse, attacked a Muslim garrison at Murat. This episode is one of the darkest chapters in Crusader history, and has been an unending source of criticism of the Crusades ever since. Being short of food already, the Crusaders were in no mood for a long drawn-out siege. They opted for a more aggressive strategy, with a siege tower attacking one side of the city, and sappers undermining a section of the wall on the other side. This strategy proved to be effective, as it forced the Muslim defenders of Murat to oscillate between the two different fronts of attack. Initially, they chose to focus on the siege tower, but once a portion of the wall collapsed, the Crusaders were inside, and Murat soon fell. However, Murat yielded little plunder, and even less food. It certainly did not have enough food to satisfy the needs of the Crusader army. At the brink of starvation, several Crusaders did the unthinkable, and turned to the corpses of the fallen Muslims for nourishment. Critics of the Crusades have, of course, found unending cause to criticize the actions of the Crusaders at Murat, and the cannibalism perpetrated here has easily become one of the most infamous atrocities of the entire crusading era. Andrew Wheatcroft says of the Crusaders' cannibalism, "This was the behavior of animals and not men." Muslim chroniclers related many acts of treachery and brutality within Islam, but there was something different about the Westerners' rude animal vigor. The qualities that made them so effective in battle also made them capable of any atrocity. Similarly, Stephen O'Shea says, "There, at Murat al-Numan, according to both Christian and Muslim chronicles, the Latin warriors killed all of the townspeople, and then set about roasting and eating them. The slain children, apparently, were a delicacy. Even to medieval eyes, this was an atrocity."
There is no such thing as a spiritual war. When you fight a war, the aim of that war is to defeat your enemy. They involve violence, they involve threats, they involve propaganda, and they involve, let's put it like this, shock and awe. And the eating of human flesh was designed to strike fear in the heart of the enemy. Here we are strong, we are tough, and if necessary, we'll eat you up alive. And to a certain extent, that succeeded. I mean, there was a wave of horror and fear. They eat us, and if they're eating us dead tomorrow, they might eat us alive.
Both Muslim apologists and modern liberals, in their attempts to demonize the Crusaders, have gone as far as to suggest that cannibalism was part of the normal activity of the Crusaders. George Proctor, for example, claims that the cannibalism of the Crusaders was not confined to one season of distress, but had become familiar to the rabble of the camp, and reached its height during the Third Famine of Antioch, when, in their desultory attacks upon the Turkish garrisons, they regularly ate the dead bodies of the infidels, and even of their own slain companions. Proctor quite simply doesn't know what he's talking about here. The sources that he relies on for cannibalism among the Crusaders at Antioch and beyond are not primary sources, and, in fact, were written for the entertainment of European nobles. Moreover, they include material which makes it clear that they are not of any historical value, at least with respect to the activities of the Crusaders. As Andrew Holt points out, the only surviving sources for claims of cannibalism at Antioch were written several decades after the event, and may have been confusing the events at Murat, which took place only months later, with the events at Antioch itself. The Chanson d'Antioch, for example, is perhaps the primary source for claims about cannibalism at Antioch, and it was written around the year 1180, more than 8 decades after the Siege of Antioch in 1098. Moreover, it was written for a French audience for the purpose of entertaining knights, and so includes fantastical stories of a battalion of armored Christian women fighting on the battlefield during the First Crusade, and other such claims that are not accepted by Crusade historians. Its account of the cannibalism at Antioch seems equally implausible, describing how some of the Crusaders, the Taffers, roasted the bodies of fallen Turks within view of the city's defenders to terrify them, and when they ran out of battlefield dead, resorted to the local Turkish graveyards for another feast. It is highly unlikely that a source from the era, lay or clerical, would have reported on such a grisly event, or that clerical authorities present on the crusade would have allowed something like this to take place as described. There does exist, however, a letter written by the crusade leadership to the Pope, dated to 1099, that suggests that the Crusaders at Antioch were so hard-pressed and desperate at that point that they considered cannibalism, but only that they considered it. So Proctor's claim is a gross exaggeration born out of fantasy with no basis in our best historical evidence. Nevertheless, this episode of the Crusades remains quite macabre. That cannibalism occurred in the aftermath of the Siege of Murat is not in question. What is in question regards both the extent and the purpose of the cannibalism. Those who are quick to criticize the Crusades have seized on this event to suggest that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism as an act of bravado or psychological warfare intended to terrify the Muslims. Sarah Grace Heller is a proponent of this idea, suggesting, here, I would emphasize that, for the old French Crusade cycle audiences, cannibalism was one of a variety of fear-inducing acts represented as part of the successes of the First Crusade, acts repeated and amplified in later times when subsequent crusades had failed and were failing. The notion of attacking Muslims, like people fighting over a plate of food, is not strictly figurative, as most Western readers would assume. However, the primary sources tell another story. The primary sources are unanimous that this was an act of desperation, born out of the starvation which the Crusaders were facing. Moreover, the accounts all express shock and dismay at this having happened at all. Our best evidence indicates that extreme hunger, rather than intimidation, is what motivated this admittedly horrific act. The extent of the cannibalism is also less than clear. Steve Wiedenkopp, for example, suggests that it was only a small number of crusaders who participated, saying, most accounts indicate that only a small minority of crusaders, perhaps a group of landless knights known as taffers, engaged in cannibalism, and only due to their state of near starvation. The awful event illustrates the extreme situations crusaders encountered throughout their journey, situations that the vast majority of crusaders endured without resorting to desperate acts. However, the eyewitness, Fulcher of Chartres, indicates that the practice could have been more widespread than Wiedenkopf, saying, "I shudder to say that many of our men, terribly tormented by the madness of starvation, cut pieces of flesh from the buttocks of Saracens lying there dead. These pieces they cooked and ate, savagely devouring the flesh while it was insufficiently roasted. In this way, the besiegers were harmed more than the besieged." What exactly many amounts to here is debatable, but Fulcher certainly indicates that the cannibalism was more widespread than even he would care to admit. Still, Fulcher is clear that starvation alone was the sole motivation for those who engaged in it, and the shock of it to him is likewise evident. Human beings have been known to resort to cannibalism under the threat of starvation. Some examples of this from more recent history include the Donner Party of 1846 to 1847, where a group of American pioneers, trapped by heavy snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains while attempting to reach California, ran out of food and resorted to cannibalism to survive. The Andes flight disaster of 1972, where a plane crashed in the remote Andes Mountains, saw survivors stranded for 72 days with almost no provisions, and they resorted to cannibalism to survive. Lastly, there was the so-called Starving Time event in the Jamestown colony from 1609 to 1610, where, during a harsh winter siege by local tribes, the English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, experienced severe famine. Archaeological evidence has since confirmed written accounts that they also resorted to consuming the corpses of fellow colonists to survive. It is also routinely assumed by critics and Muslim apologists that cannibalism, whether motivated by desperation or by psychological warfare, was unique to the Crusaders. Such critics forget that, as I demonstrated in my previous video, there is some evidence to suggest that Muslims also engaged in cannibalism of Christians when they conquered Spain. As Dario Fernandez Morera reminds us, shortly after the Islamic forces landed, the flesh of the cadavers of some Christians killed in battle were boiled in large cauldrons under the sight of terrified Christian prisoners who became convinced that the Muslims were cannibals. And contrary to the primary sources for the Crusades, there is good reason to think that the Muslims who conquered Spain, whether or not they actually engaged in cannibalism, genuinely were engaged in psychological warfare, since this episode did not happen under starvation conditions. Some critics have challenged the idea that the Crusader cannibalism was purely an act of desperation, instead suggesting that the Crusaders actually were engaging in some sort of psychological warfare. Antonio Santucioso hints at ulterior motives, saying, although cannibalism may have been in part the result of starvation among the Franks, it was also the kind of behavior that spread the utmost fear among the enemy. J. Rubinstein comes right out and says it, writing, spurred by a combination of severe hunger and prophetic rage, some members of the army turned to a now familiar, if horrifying, solution: cannibalism. This time they did so proudly, having learned how to use psychological warfare to their advantage. Eamon Maylauf is just as explicit. He asks, did the Western invaders devour the inhabitants of the martyred city simply in order to survive? Their commander said so in an official letter to the Pope the following year, but the explanation seems unconvincing, for the inhabitants of the Marat region witnessed behavior during that sinister winter that could not be accounted for by hunger. Were they cannibals out of necessity or out of fanaticism? It all seems unreal, and yet the evidence is overwhelming, not only in the facts described, but also in the morbid atmosphere it reflects. In this respect, one sentence by the Frankish chronicler Albert of Aix, who took part in the Battle of Marat, remains unequaled in its horror. Not only did our troops not shrink from eating dead Turks and Saracens, they also ate dogs. So why doesn't Maelov find it convincing that the cannibalism at Marat was solely for the purpose of survival? His only evidence for this is a citation from Albert of Aix, who said that the Crusaders didn't just eat the bodies of the fallen Muslims, but also of dogs. But how exactly is this supposed to count against the thesis that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism due to starvation? That they ate dogs as well is perfectly compatible with, arguably supportive of, the thesis that they did this because they were starving. So while Maelov finds it unconvincing that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism out of necessity, despite numerous statements from them explicitly saying this, I find it unconvincing that they had ulterior motives simply because Albert of Aix mentioned that they also ate dogs. J. Rubinstein makes a better attempt than Maelov to render this suggestion plausible, saying, "What we have in these three accounts of Guibert, William, and Chanson is cannibalism, pretended or otherwise, not because of necessity, but as an aspect of psychological warfare. The cannibalism was intended to strike fear in the enemy, and literally to strike at them with Christian teeth." But the key difficulty with Rubinstein's suggestion here lies in the sources upon which he is depending. His suggestion here can only seem plausible by giving priority to later sources from non-eyewitnesses over earlier sources from eyewitnesses who are unanimous that it was starvation that motivated the cannibalism. Giving greater weight to later sources is generally bad historical practice. Furthermore, one of the sources upon which his suggestion depends is the Chanson d'Antioch, which, as we have already seen, is known to be an unreliable source. His other sources actually deny that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism at all, and instead claim that the Crusaders simply made it appear as though they were eating the Muslim corpses so as to terrify the Saracens. While, at a glance, this may seem to support Rubinstein's thesis that the cannibalism was a form of psychological warfare, these sources actually work against him, since they either deny, or at least question, that cannibalism occurred at all. The more weight one gives them, the less weight one can give to the idea that any of the Crusaders were cannibals in the first place. The less weight that one gives to these sources, the less they can depend upon them to justify the idea that the Crusaders cannibalized Muslim corpses as a form of psychological warfare. Most historians of the Crusades have thought that it is best to take the eyewitnesses at their word that the cannibalism was indeed the result of starvation conditions. Rubinstein himself admits this elsewhere, saying, Guibert of Nogent blamed the cannibalism on a band of poor soldiers he called the Taffers. Modern writers have either followed Guibert's lead and accused the Taffers for what went wrong, or they have preferred the testimony of Raymond of Aiguillers and the author of Deeds of the Franks, who both placed the cannibalism after the siege had ended and blamed it only on sharp, unexpected hunger. They also were eyewitnesses, and modern historians, like medieval ones, tend to put greater weight on eyewitness testimony. Rubinstein's response to this has been to suggest that the eyewitnesses would have had reasons to lie about the real motivations behind the cannibalism, since, because they were present, they could be implicated. As he says, as eyewitnesses, however, they were also potentially implicated in the cannibalism. It was in their interest to explain it away. Nevertheless, this is an admission that our best evidence for the cannibalism does indeed contradict Rubinstein's hypothesis. Furthermore, Rubinstein ignores how this explanation creates tension with his hypothesis. If the purpose of the cannibalism truly was, as Rubinstein supposes, to terrorize the Muslims, then the Crusaders should have been proclaiming this loudly and proudly, not trying to explain it away. The very fact that, on his own hypothesis, the Crusaders felt the need to try to explain the cannibalism away by recourse to starvation is itself evidence against the idea that it was a form of psychological warfare. For had it been psychological warfare, they would have felt no need whatsoever to explain it away. In conclusion, the best explanation surely seems to be that the eyewitnesses were telling the truth when they said that the cannibalism was solely motivated by starvation. Later sources from non-eyewitnesses, who were clearly embarrassed by these reports, tried to spin things so that the cannibalism never really happened and that it was all just a stunt to scare the Muslims. This is how most contemporary experts of the Crusades judge the evidence, and, despite the ingenuity of Rubinstein's argument, he has not shown that his alternative explanation is superior to the standard one. In sum, then, there is really no compelling argument to justify the idea that cannibalism was an act of terrorism on the part of the Crusaders. We would do well to take our earliest and most trustworthy sources at face value when they repeatedly insist that the cannibalism was a desperate measure born out of starvation conditions. Obviously, none of this is intended to justify the cannibalism of the Crusaders at Marat, but it is intended to counter the narrative that the Crusaders regularly engaged in cannibalism, or that they did so as an intimidation tactic. Those who engaged in cannibalism did so at the utmost end of need brought about by prolonged starvation conditions. And though this is not a justification for what they did, it does serve to render it somewhat more understandable. I think Nirmal Das perhaps said it best. War and severe privation dehumanize people. This is the only thing to be understood from the incident of cannibalism at Marat. To read it as indicative of cultural or philosophical positions of the Crusaders is simply a failure to come to grips with the necessary and wretched brutality of war. After about a year of delay following the conquest of Antioch, the Crusaders were prepared to march on Jerusalem. They opted for a bold but risky strategy. Rather than taking the time to occupy the major strongholds between Antioch and Jerusalem, the Crusaders chose to march along the coastal road at breakneck speed to arrive at Jerusalem before the Muslim Fatimids could mount any serious obstacles to their advance. The gamble paid off, insofar as they did indeed reach Jerusalem without encountering any serious resistance from the Fatimids. However, it left the Crusaders without a strong supply chain back to friendly territory, and it also left them vulnerable to enemy attacks from behind. As Asbridge says, Fatimid incompetence had allowed the Franks to cover more than 300 kilometers from Tripoli to Jerusalem in less than a month. Had the Egyptians attempted even a limited defense of Palestine, the crusade could have been stopped in its tracks. As it was, the Fatimids either misjudged the Franks' intentions or grossly underestimated their ability to march at speed, because the crusade was allowed to advance virtually unchallenged. The Latins did pay a price for the rapid, almost headlong pace of their approach. Leaving cities such as Beirut and Acre unconquered in their wake, the Crusaders had now placed themselves in a position of extreme isolation, with no network of communication or logistical support to fall back on. It was a move of the utmost daring, at once expedient and visionary. Knowing that they lacked the manpower or resources to overcome all Palestine, the Franks chose to make a last-ditch strike at its heart, but they would probably never have taken such an immense gamble if not possessed by pious conviction, a steadfast belief in the force of divine protection. In the cold light of strategic reality, failure to secure the almost immediate capture of Jerusalem would leave the stranded expedition facing extermination. On the 13th of June, 1099, under the command of Duke Godfrey of Bouillon, the Crusaders launched a full frontal assault on Jerusalem. The initial attack was poorly organized, and the Crusaders lacked the siege engines necessary to make their aggressive strategy effective. Consequently, the Fatimids were able to beat the Crusaders back from Jerusalem's walls. Fortunately, on the 17th of June, reinforcements and supplies arrived at Jaffa. The Crusaders retrieved these and quickly set about constructing powerful siege engines. The most important of these were 2 siege towers. On the 14th of July, 1099, the Crusaders once again mounted an all-out assault on Jerusalem. The Fatimid defenders had, of course, been preparing for this assault, but Godfrey managed to surprise them in an act of incredible strategic deception and logistical brilliance. As Asbridge explains, Godfrey and his allies, ranged before Jerusalem's northern walls, had for the last 3 weeks been building their siege tower in front of the city's quadrangular tower. The Fatimids had naturally responded by readying themselves for an attack in that area, strengthening that section of the wall, and concentrating troops there. This was just what the Crusaders had hoped for. All along, their conspicuous preparations had been a ruse. In the middle of the night, the Franks set about breaking down the siege tower into its constituent parts, portaging them almost 1 kilometer to a position east of St. Stephen's Gate, and then re-erecting the entire structure. This was an incredible technical accomplishment and an awesome feat of physical endurance, but the rewards were considerable. Raymond Ibrahim adds, while the weary Muslims had slept, the equally exhausted but indefatigable Christians had, under Godfrey's leadership and the cover of night, continued to pursue the war. Especially adding Christian insult to Muslim injury was a large cross shining brightly with gold fixed atop Godfrey's tower. With both siege towers strategically placed, the battle for Jerusalem commenced. The Fatimids must have put up a good fight, for the first siege tower, under the command of Raymond of Toulouse, was peppered so heavily with grease and flaming missiles that it eventually went up in flames. But the rejoicing was short-lived, as Godfrey's siege tower managed to breach the east wall. Having succeeded in breaching the outer defenses, Godfrey moved his tower closer to the walls of Jerusalem itself. At one moment, the Crusaders succeeded in setting fire to the wooden substructure of Jerusalem's walls, which had the Muslim defenders at this area running scared. Godfrey saw this and moved his siege tower towards this point. He lowered a makeshift bridge, providing the Crusaders an entryway into Jerusalem itself. Again, Ibrahim narrates, in this smoky inferno, Godfrey, with his renowned strength, single-handedly heaved a platform from his tower to the city's wall. It was quickly bridged by 2 of his men, German brothers, Ludolf and Engelbert, followed by Godfrey and his brother Eustace. Scores of inflamed crusaders followed the Germans. From here, the battle very quickly turned in favor of the crusaders. The defenders faltered, and a massacre ensued. The Crusaders' sack of Jerusalem in 1099 is easily one of the most notorious chapters of the First Crusade, attracting ceaseless criticisms from critics. Perhaps no event in the entire history of the Crusades has managed to draw more outrage and critique from modern critics. One need not look very far to find examples such as Andrew Wheatcroft saying such things as, "In Islamic eyes, the most extraordinary example of the Crusaders' viciousness came as Jerusalem was finally captured." Similarly, Jill Claster writes, "The intensity of the cruelty that then occurred strained the descriptive powers of the chroniclers who witnessed it. Although the precise words they used are somewhat different, they all reported the same degree of horror that ensued." Brian Catlos paints an even more grim picture, saying, "The Crusader forces showed little focus and no restraint, plundering and massacring indiscriminately as they coursed through the city, hastily marking the doors of homes to claim their rights of pillage." Plundering was normal practice in the Middle Ages, but what took place after the city of Jerusalem fell was nothing less than a deliberate act of genocide. Horrific as the attacks may have been, the Franks sincerely believed they were performing God's work, and they were taking revenge for the desecration of this most holy city and cleansing it with the Muslims' blood. But by far, the strongest words on the subject come from Sir Stephen Runciman when he claims, "The massacre at Jerusalem profoundly impressed all the world. No one can say how many victims it involved, but it emptied Jerusalem of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Many even of the Christians were horrified by what had been done, and amongst the Muslims, who had been ready hitherto to accept the Franks as another factor in the tangled politics of the time, there was henceforth a clear determination that the Franks must be driven out. It was this bloodthirsty proof of Christian fanaticism that recreated the fanaticism of Islam, when later wiser Latins in the East sought to find some basis on which Christian and Muslim could work together. The memory of the massacre stood always in their way." Undeniably, the scale of the slaughter at Jerusalem was substantial. As noted earlier, a violent sacking was part and parcel of medieval siege warfare. It was the credible threat of a violent sacking that often caused cities to surrender to attackers without a fight. That was the deal. If a city surrendered, then they would be spared. If they did not, then the attacking army was given free rein to do as it pleased once the city fell. One can be critical of the ethics of medieval siege warfare, but it's important to realize that this was simply how things were done at this time. To act as though the slaughter of Jerusalem was uniquely horrific or unprecedented in medieval siege warfare is simply incorrect. This was perfectly normal, even expected, according to the practices of the day. I say this not to excuse any atrocities perpetrated by the Crusaders against the citizens of Jerusalem, but rather to contextualize their actions in order to make them understandable. From the aforementioned quotations, one would get the idea that the Crusaders engaged in some sort of outrageous butchery of the people of Jerusalem, even by the standards of their own day. And I simply want to emphasize that this is not at all true. This is how pretty much every successful medieval siege ended. It was not something unusual or unprecedented. In fact, when the Seljuk Turks had conquered Jerusalem in 1073, under Asid ibn Uwaq, they too had slaughtered a substantial portion of the Christian population. Muslim chroniclers estimated that the Turks had killed some 75,000 inhabitants, nearly exactly the same number as later Muslim chroniclers claimed that the Crusaders slaughtered in 1099. As we shall see in a moment, in both cases, these estimates are wildly exaggerated. But the point in comparing them is to push back against the idea that the Crusader takeover of Jerusalem in 1099 constituted some sort of unprecedented atrocity, as critics claim. If Muslim sources are to be believed, then the Crusaders and the Turks dealt out approximately the same level of carnage, respectively, when they conquered Jerusalem. As Christopher Tyerman highlights, massacres were not a monopoly of Western Christians. The recent Turkish conquests in the Near East had been accompanied by carnage and enslavement on a grand scale. When it suited, Muslim victors could behave as bestially as any Christian, as Zengi showed at Edessa in 1144, and Saladin was to prove in suppressing opposition in Egypt in the 1170s and in the killing of the Knights of the Military Orders after the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Immediate contemporary Muslim reactions appear muted when contrasted to later polemics. Massacres, as well as atrocity stories, were and are an inescapable part of war. As a second point, the Muslims did things to enrage the Crusaders, and in that sense invited retribution. Specifically, they would hang crosses over the walls of Jerusalem and spit or urinate on them to taunt the besieging Crusader army. As Raymond Ibrahim says, safe behind their walls, the Muslims jeered, they shot arrows and catapulted projectiles at the crowded procession, killing a few and injuring many. Moreover, and to show their scorn and contempt for the Christians, the Muslims set up crosses on the walls, and on these they vented all kinds of shameful insults. They broke and smashed the crucifixes against the walls, spat on them, and did not shrink from urinating on them in full view of everyone, all while pouring forth blasphemous words and taunts against our Lord Jesus Christ and his doctrine of salvation. Furthermore, in anticipation of the siege, they had relieved all of the Christians remaining in Jerusalem of their possessions and then expelled them from the city, further infuriating the Crusaders. Obviously, this does not justify a slaughter of the citizens, but once again, this does at least help to explain why the Crusaders probably felt a degree of righteous indignation towards the Muslim population. A third point to remember is that the actual scale of the slaughter is almost impossible to accurately determine. Contemporary sources give wildly incongruous estimates in this regard. Even Muslim sources cannot agree, giving estimates ranging from 3,000 to 70,000. As Jonathan Riley Smith remarks, the only contemporary Muslim evidence suggests that the number of deaths may not have been as high as has been supposed. So the actual death toll on the people of Jerusalem is uncertain. Furthermore, the higher estimates are just known to be wildly exaggerated because they are far higher than the total population of Jerusalem could have realistically been in 1099. As Steve Wiedenkopf points out, the event is well known because both Islamic and Christian chronicles record it, although there are discrepancies among the various accounts. Some claim the massacre went on for several days, others that it occurred on the first day only. The Christian sources do not agree on how many were killed. Fulcher records that 10,000 were massacred, while others indicate only several hundred. Some Islamic sources provide wildly inflated numbers, claiming upwards of 75,000 killed. The city's entire population was between 20,000 and 30,000. It is probable that anywhere from several hundred to 3,000 were slain by the Crusaders. Christopher Tyerman adds, some thousands, men, women, and children were massacred, although certainly fewer than the 70,000 trumpeted in early 13th century Arabic chronicles. Critics will make much of the eyewitness accounts' descriptions of bloodshed during the slaughter. For example, Connor Caustic writes, for the rest of the evening until nightfall, all the subsequent violence was simply butchery. So many Muslims had fled into the mosque that the scene there was hellish. Blood was splashed all up the walls, over the doors, seats, tables, and columns. It was impossible to move through the building without walking through streams of blood, and those who did so were soaked in gore up to their knees. The massacre in Jerusalem at the end of the Crusade was grim even by medieval standards. Within 2 generations, even Christians living in Jerusalem would describe the events at the temple on the 15th of July with a sense of horror rather than pride, while the Muslim and Jewish world naturally came to mark the date with an indelible sense of appalling tragedy. But these eyewitness descriptions of the amount of bloodshed are almost certainly hyperbolic. It seems unlikely, just on its face, that the Crusaders were literally wading in blood up to their knees, or actually riding in the blood of the Muslims up to the bridles of their horses. As Thomas Madden says, as horrible as the carnage was in the mosque and in the rest of the city, it could never be enough to sustain the reports of streets of blood that are heard so often today. These are fantastical descriptions, clearly impossible. Modern descriptions of Crusaders wading through streets of blood turn a historical massacre into little more than a cartoon. The blood that was spilled in the massacre of Jerusalem was real. The rivers of it that course down the pages of modern newspapers and popular books are not. Nirmal Das adds, like so many such details in medieval chronicles, this is a trope of the utter destruction of the enemy. It should not be taken literally. It is true that a lot of inhabitants of Jerusalem were killed by the Crusaders, but it is also true that many were not. Thus, a medieval trope needs to be stylistically read. Furthermore, the specific language used by the eyewitnesses harks back to biblical references, which suggest that the language being used is both symbolic and exaggerated. Biblically literate clerics of the 11th century would all have understood the allusion to Revelation 14:20, which reads, and the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for a distance of about 200 miles. In the Vulgate, the Latin reads exactly as in one first-hand account. It appears unlikely that anyone was taking this description literally. Again, Wiedenkopf explains, one interesting thing is the similar language used in the Christian sources to describe the bloodshed. The Gesture records that the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to the ankles. Fulcher of Chartres recorded that within the temple, about 10,000 were beheaded. If you had been there, your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. In a letter sent to Pope Paschal II, the Crusade leaders informed the Pope about the killings, writing, and if you desire to know what was done with the enemy who were found there, know that in Solomon's porch and in his temple our men rode in the blood of the Saracens up to the knees of their horses. Finally, Raymond de Aguiliers recalled this event and wrote, "It is sufficient to relate that in the Temple of Solomon and the portico, crusaders rode in blood to the knees and bridles of their horses." Most Christian accounts of the initial events in Jerusalem after the Crusader liberation utilized similar language in describing the amount of blood spilled by those killed. The blood of the slain was either ankle deep, calf deep, or up to the knees of the horses. What most modern people fail to understand is that this language was not meant to be taken literally or to leave a factual record of the numbers of those killed. Rather, it was intended to recall passages of scripture that medieval people would instantly recognize, such as Revelation 14:20, which says, "And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle." The city in the passage from Revelation is a reference to Jerusalem as the true city of the saints, and the imagery of blood and divine wrath refers to the judgment of unbelievers. Blood flowing up to a horse's bridle, meanwhile, is figurative battle language and functions hyperbolically to emphasize the severe and unqualified nature of the judgment. In using well-known language and imagery from Scripture, First Crusade commentators made the point that victory over Muslim forces throughout the Crusade, and specifically at Jerusalem, was ordained by God as a judgment against unbelievers. We may thus summarize our response to those critical of the siege of Jerusalem under the 5 following points. First, the Crusaders' behavior was not a divergence from the norms of medieval siege warfare, and, therefore, did not constitute some sort of unprecedented outrageous act. Second, the Muslims within Jerusalem are not completely blameless, as they did things to enrage the Crusaders during the siege, and thereby drew their ire. Third, the contemporary sources all vastly disagree with respect to how many were actually killed, with the earlier sources from both Christians and Muslims reporting far lower numbers of casualties than the later sources. This suggests that exaggeration took place over time. Fourth, it is patently absurd to read the descriptions from eyewitnesses reporting rivers of blood literally. And fifth, the language used deliberately utilizes the divine judgment language of Revelation, which further supports the idea that the statements about streets flowing with blood is not intended to be read literally, but rather as a metaphor for God's retribution against his enemies. At long last, Jerusalem was once again within Christian hands. With so many potential failure points, the First Crusade should have never succeeded. Yet against all odds, it did. The Crusaders immediately set about forging various Crusader kingdoms: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the crown jewel, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Of course, a kingdom needs a king. Duke Godfrey was seemingly the only Crusader leader who had kept the vision of the Crusade, and since the great victory at Jerusalem had owed so much to his strong leadership and his strategic brilliance, he seemed to be the obvious choice. While Godfrey would go on to rule Jerusalem, he humbly refused the title of king, his reasoning purportedly being that it would not be proper for him to wear a crown of gold in the same city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. As I said in the beginning, the First Crusade is the ultimate story of unlikely success. It is a testament to what the right combination of faith, courage, and grit can accomplish. To be sure, it has its dark chapters. My intention in this video has certainly not been to portray the Crusaders as saints who never did anything wrong, but I have attempted to counterbalance the popular narrative which has unfairly, in my judgment, warped the popular perception of the First Crusade as some sort of dark stain on the reputation of Christianity or Western culture. I hope that, if nothing else, I have convinced viewers that there is another side to the story, one which, if correct, allows Western Christians to take a degree of pride in the epic accomplishments of our forefathers. This video has covered the history of the First Crusade. Along the way, I have taken some space to counter criticisms and misinformation regarding the First Crusade. While there is space for legitimate criticisms of certain episodes, the critics typically erase or ignore the context and nuance of these events. Frequently, their claims simply are altogether false. My hope is that this video has done some work towards setting straight the record concerning the First Crusade. Like most wars, it contained both shameful and praiseworthy chapters, but it was certainly not the darkest chapter in the history of Christianity, or something that contemporary Christians need to feel shame or embarrassment over.